everyone. On behalf of the Peninsula Foundation, I warmly welcome you all to today's webinar titled Trump's Global Tariffs, Disruptive Strategy or Mindless Chaos. My name is Divya, a research analyst from the Peninsula Foundation, and I'll be your host for this session this evening. Before we begin, here are a few quick guidelines to help us ensure that our webinar runs smoothly. Please keep your microphones muted unless you're asked to speak. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to drop them in the chat box. We'll either address this in the Q&A session or we can use it for the discussion as well. Kindly do not share your screen. Lastly, this is to inform that this session is being recorded. Over the next 90 minutes, we'll take a deep dive into the motivations, impact, and long-term consequences of tariff policies introduced during Trump's presidency, a shift that many argue disrupted the global trade architecture. We are honored to have with us three highly respected experts whose insights will help us better understand this evolving geopolitical economic landscape. Let me take a moment to introduce our distinguished panelists. First, Professor Arun Kumar, a retired professor of economics at the Jawaharlal Nehru University. He has held the chair in the Center for Economic Studies and Planning until 2015. He served as the chair professor at the Institute of Social Sciences. With a PhD in economics from JNU and a master's in physics from the Princeton University, Professor Kumar brings a rare interdisciplinary perspective to economic analysis. He is widely recognized for his pioneering work on the Black economy in India, public finance, and alternative economic policy. Second, we have Professor Mahendra P. Lama, a renowned economist and senior professor at Jawaharlal Nehru University. He was the founding vice chancellor of Sikkim University, former economic advisor to the government of Sikkim, and a member of India's National Security Advisory Board. Currently, he serves as the eminent persons group on Nepal-India relations and leads key government initiatives and broader connectivity and Northeast Vision 2047. And a moderator for the evening, Air Marshal M. Madheshwaran, AVSM VM, is the president of the Peninsula Foundation and a former deputy chief of Integrated Defense Staff. With 39 years of experience in the Indian Air Force as a fighter pilot, he specializes in aerospace, defense, and geopolitics. To begin our session, I now invite Air Marshal M. Madheshwaran, President of the Peninsula Foundation, to provide an overview of the topic and set the context for today's discussion. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Vidya. It's once again a great pleasure to have Professor Arun Kumar with us once again, and Professor Mahendra Lama, both renowned economists, to discuss a very disruptive, important topic of these days across the world, not just for India though, but for the entire world. I will just give an overview of what, to just set the stage for the further discussions. And as I finish, then I'll request the panelists, Professor Arun Kumar first, and followed by Professor Mahendra Lama, to give initial comments for 10 to 12 minutes and each, and then we can move on for further discussions as we move along. To start the discussions, well, ever since Trump won the elections, now he's been very, his statements have been very frequent, very talkative. And then, of course, he announced that he will drop the bomb on tariffs on April 2nd, which he did religiously. And thereafter, I think for a week, that frequent demonstrations in terms of announcements, talking and threats continued. But now, over the last 3 weeks, he seems to have gone a bit more silent as the repercussions have started, hitting the US and other systems of the US government and the senators and the Congress. Well, what is the purpose? Now, obviously, Trump says the US has been taken for a ride for a long time. It's actually funding rest of the world, and rest of the world is not giving them the kind of respect that they should have. There's a huge amount of trade imbalance between US and other countries, and this needs to be brought down. And therefore, the tariffs are a strategy to set that right. Fundamentally, he quite clearly says I'm going to threaten you to, with higher tariffs so that you come back to us on the negotiating table, and then we'll sort that out, mutually agreeable tariffs for further movement along. Well, uh, any great power, any hegemon of the world is also aware that he has to provide global public goods. And that global public goods, as the hegemon's tenure gets along, tends to become more expensive because others are coming up. In the context of the US set up the global economic order in 1945. Although from 1950s, the Cold War started, and then you had a sort of a check on the US unrestrained power by the Soviet Union, which maintained some kind of a bipolar structure for another 2 to 3 decades. But the Soviet Union was not a match. As we went past the 70s, it was clear that it wasn't a match for the US in economic terms. And quite naturally, by 1989, the Soviet Union melted away. And the unipolar moment arrived, and I think that probably brought in the kind of hubris that we've seen in the American side. The US maintains military bases in about 80 countries. And it crafted the economic order in 1945 with the Bretton Woods system by crafting IMF and World Bank. All of that have been crafted to service the US and the former colonial powers more than the rest of the world. Much of the world took another 2 decades, right up to the 60s, to get decolonized completely. But they were extremely weak, and therefore they were under the mercy of these countries, while they were taken in that the US and the World Bank and the IMF is providing this support. But as the rest of the world has grown, as WTO, which was crafted primarily by the US, and China was brought in thinking that China will play according to US diktats, and that China has grown beyond anybody's size and imagination. The US now finds that majority of the world has grown in economic terms, and therefore that control with which they were able to wield power, economic power, is now slipping away. So quite obviously, the tariff is a disruptive strategy. Or is it a disruptive strategy? And are they trying to restructure the global economic system? Is that possible? So to start with this overview, let me first then open out, requesting the panelists to address the 2 or 3 basic questions, which are, what is the purpose and motivation for the global tariff strategy of Trump? Is it his idea, or is there a very calibrated, well-calculated economic advisory group? Stephen Merrin is the chair of the economic advisory group, and his paper is well, discussed across the world. Is this a part of that strategy? The conservative think tank Heritage Foundation in the middle of last year, released their report of Project 2025 that also gives, and quite a few of those have been followed by Trump's team as well. So there is a disruption that is being played out in the American administration. There is a disruption being brought about in the international relations segment. Their allies are being shaken up. And now, of course, he's thrown the bomb into the economic, domain as well. Where will this take the world? Where will US be at the end of this first stage of disruptive strategy? What are the next few steps? So what would be the objectives fundamentally? Can we see that as we go along? And how will this impact for countries like India? And how do we play around, or how do we deal with this particular disruptive strategy? So let me start with Professor Arun Kumar. It's all yours.
Thank you very much. I would like to thank the Peninsula Foundation for inviting me, and thanks especially to Air Marshal Mahatheswaran for inviting. Now, I'll slightly deviate. I'll set the background to the questions that are asked. So, as was said, that Donald Trump characterized April 2 as a liberation day, for the US. He says, future generations will remember this day. So there was a ring of justification when he talked about reciprocity. He meant that if some nation levies tariff on us, we levy equal amount of tariff on that. But actually, that's not what has happened. What he's done is pure protectionism. The formula that he's using to calculate this has very little to do with the balancing trade. It is, the deficit in the, trade divided by the export from that country and divided by 2. That becomes a formula. That has nothing to do with, trying to balance the trade, etc. So the question is, this high tariff is actually protectionist. It is not a reciprocity, not the justification, the moral justification that he was trying to get for himself. Now, as Marshall has said, there's been a pause since the 9th. I think he's trying to buy time to bargain with individual nations. And he saw the turmoil in the stock markets, especially the decline in the bonds, market, where the yields on the bonds have risen because people are getting rid of the US Treasury bonds, which was supposed to be actually stable, but people seem to have lost confidence in the US economy. So this delay in implementation is actually a response to this. Now, except for China, others, he's going to bargain with, and he says in 90 days, there'll be 90 bargains. But I think there are other factors also, apart from the stock market, the signal of recession that might be coming. There were a lot of protests in the US, not only on this tariffs, but also on the various policies that he's brought about. And the courts are beginning to intervene to stop some of the actions that President Trump is taking. And I think, if the situation in the US deteriorates, then in the coming 1.5 years, there'll be another election for Senate and Congress. And there he might lose if prices rise, if the unemployment situation goes out of hand in the US. So the trifactor on the basis of which he was pushing his policies, that trifactor may be disrupted. And what I see is that the capitalism's soft face is being replaced by a hard face. This soft face was that, there'd be give and take. There'd be countries which are weak. They would give some concession. In return, they'll get some concession. The rich countries will get some concession, especially the USA. So capital has become highly mobile in the last 35 years, but labor is restricted. So what has happened is that capital has gained an upper hand in entire world, and there's a rightward drift across the world, whether you see in Europe, the various right-wing parties rising, you see it in Asia, in Latin America. There are, of course, exceptions like Lula in Brazil. But as a result of this, what has happened is that the marginalized sections have been suffering, and they continue to suffer for the moment. So the question arises that what Trump is doing, is he a free marketeer or not? And what I would say is that, within the US, the way he's giving freedom to big business, he's a free marketeer. But across the world, he's not a free marketeer. There he's, imposing his will, and he wants to, regulate how the trade takes place, how the production takes place in the different economies, etc. He wants to make it more palatable to the, US to try and get upper hand. The US wants to get an upper hand. But the point is that where did the crisis emanate? The crisis in the US was emanating from lack of employment generation, of good employment. I mean, there were employment which was not very good, but a good employment, like in the case of intermediate technology goods like automobiles and steel, etc., that was going out of the US. And that's why he was saying that these jobs have gone to China, Mexico, and India. And he'd try and bring these jobs back. And that's why you see, even before he took office on 20th January, there were big businessmen who were lining up at his residence in Mar-a-Lago in Florida, promising big investments, So everybody was coming, UAE, this, that, and the other, they were all promising. So the question is, why anyway the multinationals were going out of the US to other countries like China, India, Mexico, etc. And that is because with the advent of WTO, the agreement was signed in Marrakesh in April 1, 1994, and the WTO came into being on 1st January 1995. What happened was that production became globally integrated, and the share of exports and imports in GDP rose very dramatically. So for instance, even in India's case, if you look at 1991, our export-import were around 7% of GDP, and today they are 22%, in 2023. The same was true of the US, Japan, various other countries. So there's a much greater global integration. And what happens is that supply chains have become very long. And we saw their disruption during the pandemic, which of course affected all the economies. Now, the reason why this is happening is that there's a division of labor. This division of labor has expanded globally. So there is a division between high technology, intermediate technology, and low technology. And because of the low wages in the developing world, it became source for cheap supplies of intermediate goods like automobiles and steel, etc. And because of competition amongst the developing world, the prices at which the developing world was supplying the advanced world, and the US especially, they were low because we were competing. So, say like textiles, they're produced in Vietnam, China, India, Bangladesh, etc. We were competing to keep them low. And because of our low wages, so therefore the relocation took place into these countries. And the advanced countries were producing high technology goods largely, and services, and they benefited from the services trade that was taking place. But unfortunately, what happens is that advanced technology production is not very labor conducive. It doesn't provide that much of employment. So therefore, the good jobs that were there in the intermediate technology, that had shifted out. The high technology items were not producing that much employment. And therefore, people, in the US, the citizens, they had to go for lower category jobs, which were not paying them that much. So in a sense, the terms of trade shifted in favor of advanced countries, but the unemployment situation also deteriorated. And this terms of trade shifting in favor of advanced countries meant that they could live beyond their means. So the US could have very high budget deficit, could have very high trade deficit, and the dollars were going out. So in effect, the blue-collar workers in the Rust Belt were very unhappy because they were not getting the good jobs. They were having to do, lower-level jobs, etc. So what is happening now is that Trump wants these intermediate technology good production to come back. But with the kind of minimum wages that exist in the US and the differential between China and the US or India and US, it's very unlikely that this would be very sustainable. So in a sense, the trade war will aggravate the problem further for the US and the world as other nations also retaliate. So both sides will go protectionist and levy high tariffs. And if US wants to produce these goods, it'll have to permanently levy high tariffs because it cannot allow the wages to go down. If the wages were to go down in the US, then anyway, the living standard would go down, and his promise that he'd improve the living standard, that would not work. So in a sense, what will happen is that as the tariffs are levied, the prices rise in the US. And when prices rise in the US, then the purchasing power of the workers would decline. So demand would decline in the US. And when demand declines, then what will happen is that the output will also decline. So this is leading towards a stagflationary situation. Now, this stagflationary situation is hard to deal with. So therefore, in a sense, we'll find a problem that the US faces. This will be aggravated by what is happening by DOGE, this group that is supposed to cut jobs. So decent jobs in government are also being cut, and that will further actually reduce the employment situation of good employment in the US, and therefore demand will be further affected. Also, what has happened is that as President Trump was coming in since October, there's been a great deal of uncertainty because he's been promising all this high tariffs. So people are shifting to safety towards dollar and gold. But as the US, trust in the US has declined, people are not trusting dollars also. People are not trusting the treasury bonds, and they are dumping the dollars and the treasury bonds. And as a result, the financial markets are affected very badly. Now, when financial markets are affected, then it affects investments, it affects the currencies, it affects the gold prices. The gold prices have been shooting up. And as a result, what has happened also is the de-dollarization has been set in motion in the US, in the world, actually. And this de-dollarization started with Ukraine war, when Russia had the sanctions against it. Then the trade between Russia and other countries, you needed alternate mechanisms. So Russia and China have been trying to work out a mechanism, and China is trying to put in place something which would be an independent of the SWIFT, because SWIFT was being used to actually implement the sanctions and so on. So multilateralism is going to be replaced by bilateralism. That's what Trump says, that I'll have 90 bargains with 90 nations. But this will deglobalize the world. So we are threatened with deglobalization and de-dollarization as a result of these moves. So to conclude, what we see is that the impact will be most acute on the unorganized sector and the marginalized sector, especially in India, because if agriculture we open up, then goods from US will come cheap and their prices will go down. If US levies high tariffs on our agriculture produce, then we will not be able to export, and therefore the prices will come down. So whichever way we look at it, the unorganized sector, the marginalized sector would suffer. Similarly, if our trade declines with the US and with the other countries, then again the same would happen. Now, the growing threat of artificial intelligence, that is actually going to create a further problem for employment generation. And that is something that should be worrying all the countries in the world. So in other words, China's power, which the US is trying to curb, China is trying to counter that by having bargains with EU, with other nations. So the strategy for the world should be that we don't levy tariffs on each other, but we do levy tariffs against the US, so that the trade with the US would go down, but trade amongst the other countries would go up. So the US economy would be affected much more than the other economies, and the US would have to reverse its policies. So India should also follow that, rather than say that we'll negotiate individually, because if there's a recession in the US economy, then our trade with the US would also go down. And because we haven't built alternate channels to trade with others, because we're putting eggs in one basket, then we'd be in trouble. And to work out a trade negotiation with the US will not be easy, because US is demanding concessions from India. And therefore, if you look at it with Europe, we have been trying to negotiate a trade agreement for the last 23 years. With Britain, we've been trying to negotiate for the last 3-4 years since 2021 end. And whichever trade agreements we've done with, say, South Korea or Southeast Asia, we've actually lost out. So because of our technological problems, our lack of enough R&D, we've suffered whenever trade negotiations have taken place. So this one-to-one negotiation with the US would also create further problems for us. So I think we need to join the rest of the bloc so that we can, increase trade with them, and then confront the US and force the US to actually reduce tariffs. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you, Professor Arun. That's wonderful, comprehensive. Professor Lama, as Professor Arun pointed out, what is the option for India? I mean, quite naturally, we've grown because of the globalized, development and globalization that exists. Now, what US is trying to do is virtually deglobalize and get into protective measures. And if you look at India's history, for a strange reason, we've not been part of any of the trading blocs. We walked out of the RCEP. We are trying to have bilateral arrangements. But I think we need to get together with everybody else to deal with US. Otherwise, it's going to be quite dangerous for us to deal with US on their terms on a one-to-one basis. So how do you look at the options for us, particularly in this environment?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Air Marshal Arun. And, the events which really happened in the course of last few months very clearly show that US is again trying to reassert itself in a slightly different manner than what it has done historically. Whenever there has been situations where US has found, particularly countries in the north led by US, has found that the countries in the south are now coming to a common platform, talking about what should be the future of the south vis-a-vis the north. The countries in the north led by US has always withdrawn. Professor Kumar raised a very pertinent issue about the terms of trade. Look at the history. The two top economists Raul Previs and Hans Singer proved to the global world that there has been a secular decline in the terms of trade of developing countries, right? Precisely because they have been they have been exporters of primary commodities and they have been importers of manufactured goods. Now that led to so much of debate in the global world in 50s, 60s, 1780s. And it took the shape of a common platform like Group of 77 or non-aligned movement or UNCTAD, right? And that common platform really fought against what they thought that a kind of an inequities brought about by the global north towards the global south, and to really sustain what they have been doing. The global south had to ask them a question. Therefore, you will see that in 60s, the global south would come together. India would play a very, very critical role, right? And set up UNCTAD, Group of 77. And that would lead to finally Global North declaring a commission known as Pearson Commission, the former Prime Minister of Canada, submitting a report saying that this should be the reforms in terms of uh, trade, in terms of technology transfer, in terms of employment, that nothing would happen. Then suddenly in the mid 1970s, in 74, you have the new International Economic Order resolutions passed by the what you call the General Assembly, and that would trigger further actions among the developing countries, finally leading to the appointment of the Brand Commission and submission of this the World in Crisis report. Now, the moment some of these critical issues raised by Brand Commission became issues of high politics, you could immediately see that the countries in the north, led by Americans, led by US, would tend to withdraw, and they withdrew from the North-South dialogue. And that's how you had the emergence of South-South cooperation, South-South dialogue, and South Commission, led by, I think, Julius Nyerere, where Professor Manmohan Singh played a very, very critical role. And today, the situation is exactly the same, that there has been a tremendous pressure because they thought that with WTO, they can manage the global world. But the structural changes in the global world, the export patterns, the technological flows, the global production centers, the supply chains, it made them really impossible to really maintain some kind of hegemonic trend they really wanted to capture. Therefore, what they are doing today is trying to realign, right? And before realigning, they would definitely bring new economic kind of chaos. They would bring extraordinary level of volatility and confusion. But you can see in doing so, again, they are extending the realist stand of them, where they think that they are telling the global world that the entire global world is chaotic, right? It's full of chaos. So the only way to control this is to really use some kind of power, and they used economic power, the military power. They are doing this now. If that is so, they are trying desperately to get into a regime where people will say, well, countries will say that we want a new economic order, and the US will say, okay, we will give you a new economic order, and that would benefit possibly the global world. But that would not happen this time, precisely because the entire machination driven to bring such kind of order is wrong. The very interesting thing about Trump is he's consistently inconsistent. A very interesting thing about it, right? Um, Look at his stance in the last regime, Trump 1 regime. And two, there are so much of contradictions in what he does, what he says. And say, for example, some of us who have done a little bit of economics, we would know that whenever you have a trade deficit, right, this trade deficit is actually a reflection of what is your capabilities as far as your export baskets are concerned. How diversified is your export basket, right? Or how powerful is your export basket? And in this case, when you have a $1.3 trillion trade deficit at the global level, US would say that, it would not say that I have a poor export basket. It would only say that I'm not able to export precisely because my imports are pretty high. My export level is okay. My imports are pretty high because I have kept the tariff boundaries, tariff barriers pretty low. So if that is the logic, then India and China today will have a huge trade deficit, right? Almost $80 billion for India, right? Vis-a-vis China. So if you go by that logic, and if India says, okay, I'm going to impose 80% tariff on Chinese, what would happen to Indian economy? Because the dependence, right? Not interdependence. The dependence is so deep-rooted today vis-a-vis China of India, right? And that is a trade volume only through official channels. The trade volume, that trade that happens, we say usually unrecorded terms of trade, right? With the trade through the neighboring countries, including through other, the immediate neighboring countries, are pretty high. Therefore, that would not work at all for a country like ours, for a country like China. But what is more serious in today's situation is Trump is not actually doing the what you call it, the propaganda of trade alone, right? He is trying to do two very simple things. One is he is going to disprove that 21st century is an Asian century. So generally, if you see the tariff walls he has brought, it's basically aimed at Asian countries, right? The Korea to the newly emerging countries like economic powers like Vietnam, India, right? Even a small country like Bangladesh, he has not given up. One is he's saying that I'm going to disprove that 21st century is going to be an Asian century. And he's bent upon that, right? The second very interesting thing is he's not trying to pinpoint the tariff only. The behind, in a very camouflaged manner, he has brought all those elements which would weaken the developing countries. Say, for example, the great debate about immigrants in US. And he's trying to say that ultimately, I'm going to really cut down your remittances to your countries, right? India being the highest recipient of remittance. He would do manipulations related to US aid, which has huge, what you call it, support in rural economies, educations on health in most of the Asian countries. He would try to sideline all those universities which really promote developing countries and the ideas from that, the Ivy Leaf universities, right? So it is not a very simple matrix he is trying to use. It's a very camouflaged manner of sidelining or cut down the role of Asian economies as far as U.S. hegemonic standing is concerned. So it's in a way he's weaponizing tariff to reestablish a new hegemonic tenor or a new hegemonic, what you call regime in the global world. Ultimately, he's aiming that I would do this way. But what is very critical at this juncture for all of us is, as you rightly said, this has brought, right, what you call it, some kind of disruptions, to a large extent dislocations, and of course, the chokes. He has really started talking about the tipping points that he would like to promote as far as the developing countries are concerned. But this gives us a kind of an unprecedented opportunity for the countries in Asia to come together. I see the Prime Minister of Singapore, talking so vehemently and so lucidly about what should be the stand of Asian countries. Particularly, he was hinting that, right? I see China desperately looking for how to manage the crisis. India, though officially at a very silent level, I'm sure India is also really thinking that we really have to realign your positions, right? Away from what you call this Indo-Pacific team, away from this all kinds of geostrategic arrangement. Therefore, it provides us a great opportunity for us to come together, right? And see in what way we can regionalize the entire working of Asian countries, right? So it may be the case that a situation like that of RCEP, where India primarily withdrew, would be revived, where China would be willing to negotiate with India on issues of how new varieties of regionalism be a kind of major or formidable challenge to the Americans. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Lama, for those wonderful initial comments. Yes, so Trump is actually, I would say, is caught in a fix. But let me ask Professor Arun Kumar, is it possible for America to get manufacturing back? Is it practical to even expect that? There is a statement that was made by Ray Dalio a week ago, where he says the America's 5% of the population are exceptionally intelligent, who actually contribute to various, developments, and that is their strength. Even out of the 5%, there are lots of immigrants, and they are supported by another 10% to 15% of the people who are very highly educated. And they, again, very large percentage are immigrants. The rest of Americans will not pass 6th class tests. Their intelligence levels are at that level, or education levels are at that level. And therefore, to be able to think of bringing back manufacturing back into the country, like old times in 1960s of Detroit, is absolutely impractical, in Ray Dalio's words. What do you think about that?
So, I think we have to be more nuanced. Dalio is not being very nuanced about what he's saying. The question, as I said, is that there is a division between high technology, intermediate technology, and low technology. Intermediate technology goods, if the same technology is used for production in India or China at our low wages, then US can never compete. There are other factors also, but wages are an important factor. In US, the minimum federal wage is $7.5, and in some states it's above $15. And say in the auto industry or in the steel industry, etc., it would be above $25. Whereas in India, a worker can be obtained for $2 per day. In Guangdong, in China also, at $1.2 you can get per hour, you can get a worker. So therefore, unless America increases, its tariff permanently, it has to levy maybe 40, 50, 60% tariff permanently. Then only would the production of these kind of items in the US be viable compared to what China or India can produce. Now, that would mean a permanent rise in the rate of inflation, because if you have such high tariffs, then you'll have a problem there. And as I said, that will mean that the purchasing power of the workers in the US would go down. Now, Trump is saying that I want to improve the American life. Instead of improving the American life, would actually deteriorate it, because the wages will not go up, but the prices will go up. And that's why I argued that it would head towards a recession, because demand would be down. And also you're cutting back on good government jobs. So therefore the demand would be further down. So in a sense, this strategy is a problem of the way the structural change in the world has taken place under WTO. In WTO, the advanced countries maintained their monopoly over the high technology, but with the money that we pay them for using their technology in intermediate goods, etc., the same technology, same automobile technology is used in, say, China, or as in the US, or elsewhere, and then China would benefit. Similarly, in the case of steel or other such items of intermediate technology goods. So in other words, it's a structural problem. And therefore, what I have argued in my article recently is that while Trump has a goal of making America great, but there's no path that he has figured out. That path of how to achieve that. He's trying various things, but they will not actually make America great. And especially if other countries get together, EU and BRICS, if they get together and they levy counter tariffs on the US, but not on each other, then the situation would change so dramatically in the US that they would be forced to go back on the tariffs that they're levying. So I think the political economy is very important. That political economy has to be looked at. What would be the political economy within the US, how the workers there, how the population there is reacting, and how the other nations are reacting. That is what will set the stage in the coming days. But if Trump is able to break the other nations, and he has 90 different negotiations with 90 countries, then of course the situation would again change. But this problem of higher prices and the problem of recession, that will continue.
But isn't the countries are already talking to each other? China is dealing with European Union. They seem to be coming to some kind of an understanding. South Korea, Japan, and China have also had this meeting and discussion.
Yeah, so discussions are going on, but it'd be difficult because you see, China exports a lot of its output, and it'll not be able to export to the US. So it'll look for alternate markets. Now, if it starts dumping, then nobody trusts China. And then, people will start levying tariffs on each other. So China would have to come to an agreement that it would not dump, and then other nations would not put tariffs on each other. So China will play the most important role. So China, Xi Jinping has gone to Malaysia, to Vietnam. He's planning to go to other Southeast Asian countries. He's also offered some concessions to India, and he's talking to the EU also. So all this has to work out with China taking the lead. And dumping should not happen. And tariffs by countries on each other, that should not happen.
Absolutely. Isn't that seems to be crystallizing on the global south, Professor Lama? Aren't they getting their act together?
You see, the attempt by President Trump to reset his manufacturing sector to generate more employment and income within US. I think that's a very far-fetched idea today, precisely because when in the last 5 to 10 years, when the manufacturing units move from China to Vietnam and to other countries, the basic driving force, of course, is the cost part of it, the wages part of it, right? So that means what? On the other hand, the global global manufacturing centers are moving towards countries where you have more of cost effectiveness. On the other hand, when US is already at a high pedestal as far as cost is concerned in manufacturing sector, US needs to restructure or realign the entire supply chains. That is not a very simple task, right? So he's using so what he's doing is he's using the easiest possible way. But as Professor Arun Kumar says, will he be able to sustain that 40, 50%, because recession is bound to be there. Inflation is bound to be there. And both these have got very high potentials of triggering internal protests, right? As no one would like to have that situation. The other situation is, US is increasingly perturbed by the fact that Chinese, which were basically an imitative economies in 1980s, gradually shifted to an innovative system in the last 20, 25 years. And by 50s, it would like to have a kind of centers which is basically triggered to inventions. So from imitations to innovations to inventions, to match this particular sphere of activities of the Chinese, the possibly the US has to mobilize the most critical elements, and that it would not be able to do given the credibility of the present political leadership. Therefore, I would feel that though this gives us a very good opportunity to realign among the Asian countries and also with some of the BRICS and of course the countries like that in EU, I think if China and India can come together, right, this could, and US would never like it to happen, right? Never, precisely because
That
the
happened.
entire
China, India.
Indo-Pacific.
Okay, could that happen with China and India joining hands together to deal with this problem?
Yeah, I think China, India, at least on major economic fronts, precisely because the level of interdependence between China and India is going to be much deeper in the course of next 10 to 20 years. The way we have started renegotiating with Chinese despite the problems in our borderlands. Therefore, what I suggest, what I feel is Trump would be increasingly isolated, right? Because he would be isolated, because even if he says that I'm going to negotiate with 90 countries, right, 50 countries, whatever it is, on a purely bilateral level, the level of credibility the Americans carried vis-a-vis a free trade regime or rule-based global governance architecture, I think that level of credibility and that level of command would steadily go down and erode further.
In that context, why has Vietnam responded so early? I mean, although Trump says he'll have 90 bilateral discussions, but no one else has come forward other than Vietnam, who's been first off the blocks to deal with it.
You see, the Vietnam, I think, never thought that it would be hit in that manner, because everyone thought that Vietnam, since a country which remained so badly war torn, everybody would be willing to support it, and they had just started. Only in the last 10 years, I would say, rather strongly, when I was teaching in China, I could see the Vietnamese talking about how to really redo the entire economic structure, right? And they are doing that, and they are at a fairly I would say, infant stage in doing that. But they have shown that they have a tremendous degree of robustness as far as global manufacturing sector is concerned. So the Japanese are eyeing on that, Chinese are eyeing on that, Indian is eyeing on that country, right? And Americans feel that that is going to be another threat, like in 80s, the newly industrializing countries, right, of Southeast Asia, right, including Korea, right? That became a major threat to what US thought that it will have a kind of the most dominant voice in the global economic world.
Yeah, absolutely. Professor Arun Kumar, in that context, is this there are many voices that say the global tariff is just the bombast and the initial part of the strategy. the real one goes back to Stephen Mirren's objective, which he writes in that paper called Mar-a-Lago Accord, trying to bring the value of dollar down and bring in, which effectively means changing the world economic order, bring in a new Bretton Woods kind of a discussion all over again and rewrite the rules of the game. You think that is possible? Is that viable?
It all depends on what happens globally. If the other nations combine together and they levy tariffs on US, matching the tariff that it is planning to levy. And, various spokespersons of the US government have said, that Trump is not going to back down from tariffs. That's because he wants to bring jobs back. And that would mean permanent tariffs. So the US economy goes down, there's a recession, dollar will go down, but because of tariffs levied by other countries, they would not have the advantage of being able to sell more cheaply in the other countries. So I think, the strategy that he has is not really worked out. I don't think he understood what all this would mean. He thought that everybody would buckle down under his threat, but even his close partners, Canada retaliated. EU is willing to retaliate. EU is paused because, of the 90 days pause. Otherwise, EU was also willing to retaliate. Britain also, to a certain extent, was willing to retaliate. So I think most of the partners of the US, they have been willing to retaliate. China, of course, has retaliated the most because, he's giving special treatment to China.
But China seems to be very well prepared this time, completely well prepared.
Well,
and exposure to, in one of the writings, it says, whatever tariffs that Trump imposes, China has made sure that its exposure to the impact of tariff will not be more than 2.8% of its GDP. They've diversified so much.
Yeah, so they have been diversifying and they've, so as not to put all eggs in the one basket. They've also, in terms of US treasuries, they've liquidated some of the US treasuries. The dependence on that has also been increased. All this is happening. Yet, because of the huge surplus that China had with the US, because now with more than 100% tariff, there can hardly be any trade. The prices would more than double. So China would be left with a huge surplus. And that is the problem. That surplus has to go elsewhere. And if that goes into India, EU, and various other countries, and they see it as dumping, then there'll be a problem. So China will have to hold back and negotiate. Now, therefore, what kind of negotiations take place in the coming months, and whether China can, build a sense of trust with other nations, because it's ultimately trust that will matter. If the trust is missing, then, the negotiations will not go forward. So China will have to play a very central role, because as the second largest economy after the US, it will have to play the big role of accommodating other nations' surpluses while negotiating with them about its surpluses. So to begin with, the Chinese economy may also go down, because if it's not able to sell the surpluses, its production would also decline. And therefore, the Chinese economy, the US economy, when they go down, the whole world economy would go into a recession, because everybody is trading with everybody else. So whether they're tariffs, cross tariffs, or whether, China and the US hold back their surpluses, there'll be recession. And that, situation would be very difficult to deal with. So in other words, let's see how things develop. What kind of negotiations China is able to do, what kind of impact Chinese economy faces, whether nations are able to put tariffs on them. And I don't see smaller countries not bargaining with the US. They'll be forced to bargain. They're too small. So they'll be bargaining with the US, they'll be bargaining with others as well. So in a sense, it's a very open question. It's a very, it's a question of crisis of capitalism. Because capitalism is unable to generate jobs, the kind of response that Trump is giving shows that he doesn't really have a path to deal with that crisis. And as I was saying, they can produce the high technology items, but that will not generate the jobs. If they attempt to do other manufacturing jobs, then they permanent high tariffs. So it's not a situation that's easy to cope with for the US and for the rest of the world. So we have to come to an agreement globally. And if the US faces a lot of problem in the coming 3-4 months, because other nations are also willing to put tariffs on it, then US would have to reverse policy and come for negotiation. So kind of WTO kind of negotiations would have to revive. So even though WTO, the developing world countries suffered, but the point is now maybe they can get a more equitable solution. So the chances, we have to take our chances, we have to be part of the bigger negotiations so that we can try and improve our situation in the world economy.
Yeah, so in the meantime, let me remind the audience, you can put your questions on the chat box. And of course, we'll open out for quick Q&A session in another 7 to 8 minutes. I just want to bring in another angle to this entire process. You know, in the 70s and 80s, Alvin Toffler wrote his famous 3 books trilogy. And in the third wave, now he describes how we moved from agricultural era to the industrial era. Now we are moving into the knowledge era. And therefore, the advanced countries will go completely into the knowledge era where manufacturing will shift to other countries. And he describes how countries that have missed the industrial revolution will have to have one leg in the manufacturing industrial era and one leg they will have to move into the knowledge era if they really want to leapfrog and catch up with the developed countries. I think China has done that extremely well. And that is what they have the manufacturing. They're also into the knowledge era in terms of innovation and development. And India is somewhere, I would say, in that place as well. So if you look at US, I think they are still earning a lot considering that majority of the knowledge era work comes from there. And despite the complaints about adverse trade and other things, much of all that is, like you said, intermediate and low production, low manufacturing areas, which is not going to come back. But the knowledge era will continue to actually give them the kind of power unless somebody now comes up at that level and challenges them, which I see only China coming up, and that's a fear probably for them. And related to that is that when they made the World Economic Order in 1945 with the Bretton Woods system, it was still 50 countries, former colonial powers largely, and rest of the world was just about coming out of the colonialism. But today's world is completely different. So whatever Trump may expect, will that work anymore? And is he out of sync or out of reality with what Alvin Toffler has actually projected?
You're asking Mahendra?
Yeah, Professor Lama, from your side. Professor Lama, can you hear me?
His frame seems to have frozen.
Yeah. You know, what is very... Can I?
Go ahead.
Yeah. What is very, what you call it, shocking is how the Bretton Woods institutions, right, or how other global institutions are just a silent spectator in the entire Trump-driven instability project. It's quite surprising. You know, for us,
your Wi-Fi is unstable. You're not able to hear you continuously.
Right. WTO. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, now it's better.
No? Yeah. Well, so I think the way these scared of speaking anything about objectively about what Trump is doing, that also shows that the institutions in the that is responsible for global governance are also totally sidelined. They also see that there is total uncertainty, right? And in such a situation, it is very important for at least this few critical countries, right, who have a global voice, including India, China, should come up with a very different agenda as to what are the alternative options. When I listen to the Prime Minister of Singapore, countries to come together and have a kind of a common stand. Yes, Europe is a critical player in this, but I think the voice should essentially come from the countries in the South as to what would be the options, what are the opportunities, and what are the alternative pathways for that. And for that to happen, as Professor Arun Kumar rightly said, Chinese have to really regain the trust it has, or that is very, very critical. The challenge within Asia is also there is a great challenge within Asia for the Chinese to regain the confidence, the trust, right, and go along with other countries. Is China prepared to do that, right? Because if it does that, then if it does that, and if it really brings all these countries into a common platform, many of the U.S.-led geostrategic, the parlance and geostrategic arrangements will also be upset, and that will be a major, major blow to US in really taking forward the what you call its economic commercial agenda.
Thank you. Professor Arun Kumar, your comments?
Yeah. So, in the knowledge, economy, or what broadly one could call the, advanced technology, the US has a huge lead. China is catching up, there's no doubt. But the chips, the advanced chips, China is not able to manufacture because the US put an embargo on that. US has also withdrawn all its software, personnel, etc. from China, even during Biden's time. It's not just now. Biden was also trying to see that China doesn't advance technologically as fast. But China has shown that it can advance, though maybe with a time lag. So China would, I think, give a run for the money, as in the case of the artificial intelligence with its DeepSeek, which it produced very cheaply compared to what Meta and others did. So China can do that. And I think if it joins in with EU and with India and other nations, I think we can also progress very fast on the knowledge front. So I think China has to give a lead so that nobody feels threatened. As Lama was rightly saying, the trust element is very important. If we have trust, we'll work together. If we don't have trust, we'll not work, and then Trump would succeed. But even then, Trump's success would actually mean the global failure, because Trump would not be able to do what it is trying to do, make America great. You cannot make America great by putting permanently high tariffs on everything. Because then you'll have recession, you'll have high prices and so on. So, the new path also would have to come from the alternate countries. So that when the US retreats, the US comes to the path that the alternate countries have managed to put together. So I think it's a challenging time because there are a lot of negotiations that have to take place to build the trust. But it's a very fruitful thing for the developing world, especially because the block of the advanced countries is broken. Because America attacked Canada, attacked the EU, and its closest allies also. So the closest allies will also not be able to trust. And then what he's doing, say, vis-a-vis Ukraine, again, there's a split between the advanced countries. So on many fronts, the advanced countries are splitting. And this offers the opportunity for the developing world to band together and to be able to get its place in the sun.
Absolutely. And I sincerely hope Trump doesn't succeed, not just for the world, but for America itself. Okay. So there are quite a few questions here. And if anybody wants to come in directly with the audio, please raise your hand and then we will allow you to come and ask the question. Let me start with Divya's. Do Trump's aggressive radical policies risk steering the United States towards a dangerous path of isolationism and global irrelevance? Anyone, either of you?
Mahin, go ahead.
Yeah. Would you like to, Arun, sorry, would you like to respond to that?
Okay, I thought you could. I've been talking, so I thought you could do it. But anyway, the point that is true, that the way US is operating, it has already got certain amount of isolation. Because some of the big economies, whether it be EU, whether it be Canada, whether it be China, the big trading partners, it has got isolated from. So there is an element of isolation that's coming in. Smaller economies cannot withstand the pressure from America. So they may actually go with America, and they may also play with both sides. But broadly speaking, the bulk of the trade, the bulk of the GDP of the world, that would be against the US. So therefore, the pressure on the US would increase. And that will happen only if we all stand together. If we are not able to stand together, then the pressure on the US would ease. It would succeed in dividing us up. But that will not be the solution that Trump wants. Because in spite of that, the US economy would suffer given the kind of situation that he has created.
Well, I would like to add
Yes, please.
something on this. You know, the Trump's propaganda, which he has been able to put through the global world, it has given us a great opportunity, particularly when the Northeast now is scattered. Northeast looks very divided. I don't know whether they are qualitatively divided or scattered, but at the face of it, they look slightly scattered and divided. But this gives us countries in the South, right, a tremendous degree of a very interesting degree of opportunity that we can set the global narratives now, right? He has just done the propaganda, but he has not been able to set the narrative. So this gives us a narrative, a good opportunity to do a narrative that will further isolate US, right? A narrative that would expose his designs, and a narrative that would really prove that this country is essentially against multilateralism, right? Till it benefited, it was a strong advocate of multilateralism. The moment it started not yielding any dividends to them, it is dangerously against multilateralism. I think this is a very good opportunity for us to do that.
Absolutely. We have a question from Rear Admiral Srikande. Sri, would you want to follow the question and point to who you want to answer?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Yes.
Great to listen to all of you on a topic that as it hasn't impacted us directly, but I'm sure it will because trade itself is such a global good. So my question was how might all this play out for Trump himself in not so much in the midterm polls, because one doesn't know what might be the level of misery for American population until then. But it doesn't seem as if it will work out very well for them. I'm not an economist by any chance, but it seems a path strewn with potholes ahead. So how might that work out? And ultimately, since the goal of all these processes is to develop domestic constituencies for the next election, what might be the dangers that perhaps they have not yet estimated? Because as Air Marshal Mateshwaran said, and as the sort of reports that guide this administration seem to suggest, there might be people in the US who have figured out the pros and cons of it and recommended this path. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, Professor.
Yeah.
Arun?
Okay, so the first point I want to make, which I wrote about in November last year after Trump's victory, that this is not a wave in favor of Trump. He had only a 1 million vote advantage over Kamala Harris. Okay, and if you see the data, then as compared to the 2020 election, there were 5 million additional voters who could vote. But he got only 1 million additional votes. So it's, 20%. It's not as if he got 50 or 60% additional votes, Second is that Kamala Harris got 9 million less votes. So that is why, the amount of vote that Biden got, Kamala Harris got 9 million less, and that's why she lost. So actually, a lot of Democrats didn't come out to vote because they were worried about, the Palestine issue and various other such things. And maybe the blacks and the Hispanics didn't want a woman president. Now, if the US economy gets hurt, and I think if the rest of the world acts in concert, the US economy start hurting within the next 2 to 3 months. prices are bound to rise if you have tariffs, okay, of this kind. 10% tariff is already there, so 10% maybe the producers will adjust their margins, maybe, so the price rise may not be 10% in the US because the margins may be adjusted, but there'll be a price rise. And there'll be a drop in production because the exports of the US would suffer if the other nations also retaliate. So that will lead to unemployment. The promise that Trump made that as soon as I come, the prices will drop. As soon as I come, the jobs will come back. That will not have happened, So he would not be able to deliver on his promises. And therefore, I suspect that the situation in the coming elections in 1.5 years' time, he would lose the majority in Senate and Congress. We already see that in Wisconsin, in the Supreme Court, the judges' election, they lost, the conservatives lost. And recently, in the various town hall meetings that the congressmen of the Republicans have held, they have been questioned, on a variety of things, not just on the economy, but also on migration, also on the following of the rule of law, etc. Judges are reacting also to what he's doing. So within the US itself, there seems to be a revolt. And that will therefore change the situation. And once that happens, the trifecta disappears, then the Congress will put spokes in what Trump is doing. Already there is some move that, they should declare illegal these tariffs, because the tariffs have to be levied on the basis of a, parliamentary consensus rather than on executive order. So he's doing it on executive order. He's taking the emergency power. That the Congress and the Senate may actually reverse. So there are lots of things that can happen within the US which will prevent Trump from carrying forward his agenda. And if the pressure from outside increases, then this will happen even faster. So therefore, my own suspicion is that I don't think Trump has more than a year or so to try and do what he's doing.
Absolutely. I think today's news is that the Californian court has taken up a case saying that these tariffs are illegal and it's not in the interest of America. So there's a court that's dealing with it in California itself. Pragya Thakur has a question. Pragya, do you want to call it out? Okay, let me call this out. Is there a... Yeah, okay, go ahead.
Sure, sir. Thank you so much, sir, for this. So, sir, my question is that as China has been doing its going all out policy, and what if it negotiates with the rest of the world before USA does and takes over from USA becoming the world's largest economy, as the protectionist policy of Trump has might become a problem for the USA itself in the larger picture. So, what would it mean for USA, and how will it impact the rest of the world? Thank you.
I think,
Yeah, Professor Lama?
It all depends, right? I would still feel that there are very steadily building pressures on the President Trump's regime and particularly himself. One, of course, is we have seen that there is a very growing institutional resistance about what he has been doing in US. You can see that flickers in different states here. And you can also see that since he has hurt almost all the systems, prevailing systems, well-established systems, including the university systems, the immigrations, anything, right? To the foreign economic assistance programs and all. So he has upset, he has hurt, and he has dislocated. So there is a strong possibility that over the years, to win election on the platform of MAGA was okay, but to sustain his entire regime on the basis of, on the platform of MAGA would be increasingly difficult for him. There is, if we have seen in other countries, right, including in Brazil, right, that whenever there are institutional resistance, when people are not able to speak, when the global world is condemning what is happening inside that particular country, then there is a strong possibility that there will be a mass upsurge. And in a way, if there is a mass of such and a President Trump is really sidelined in what is this, it's going to be a big lessons for all the democratic countries, one. Secondly, it is also going to be a big lessons for how not to demolish or how not to manage the international institutions, the institutions that believe in rule of law or kind of efficient governance system, right? And I think that is going to be a question of time only as far as US is concerned, because the all the media, right, except few, most of the global media today very vehemently condemn what he is doing, right? Everyone talks about chaos, everybody talks about contradictions, and everybody talks about dislocations he has been able to bring, he has been able to induct without giving any notices to the global world.
I think the question of, what would happen to China, and China's strategy, I would just like to add one thing apart from the trust. If the US gets destabilized, then investment may move to other countries if they provide a stability. That could actually give a boost to the other economies as compared to the US. US is claiming that it's going to invest huge amounts. Trump is claiming that a lot of investment would flow in. But given the uncertainties that have been created, the decline, or rather the pulsations that you see in the stock market, the decline of the US treasuries, I think investment in the US would also suffer. Global investment in the US would suffer. If there's a decline in demand in the US, again, it'll suffer. And then that investment might want to move out to other economies which provide stability. So if China presents a picture of stability and of global, global order, then it might move into Europe and India and China. And that could be an opportunity that could be used to actually boost the economies in other parts of the world as compared to the American economy. So I think China would have to play a very central role in that. As Lamas also said, as I said earlier, China has to create the trust globally to be able to do that. So China has the central role to play. EU also has to play a very important role, there's no doubt, but China above all has to play a very central role.
Thank you. Colonel Bhaskaran, if you want to call out your question, you can go ahead.
Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah, actually, what I try to convey is that, or ask, is that the Trump's trade war changed the global business. In the sense, the country's dependence on China or the market or the products which are the day-to-day basis pay, whatever, all those items which are being used. So everything has been imported from China to America. Now the dependence has been shifted. Now, with all that, Trump's initiative for the tariff on China, heavy tariff on China, and the focus has been shifted to, opportunities have been shifted to countries like India, Vietnam, and many other countries. In that case, do we grab that kind of an opportunity? Do we have that kind of red tapeism to avoid, or the bureaucratic controls, and open up with all that infrastructure facilities available so that we can grab the market?
Professor Lama?
Oh, yes, definitely. China has a great advantage also. I was just checking its degree of openness, the trade GDP ratio. It has come down from 35% to almost 20% today. That means what? That means it is in control of, because it knew that Americans would do this particular actions anytime. That's why they really started manipulating their systems in such a manner. But the biggest challenge today is because I would say geoeconomics is fine, but as far as China, India, and China and other neighboring countries are concerned, geopolitics is very, very critical. Unless and until China addresses geopolitical issues in a convincing manner, right, in a durable manner, and and does some kind of regret act as what it has done in the past that has brought so much of mistrust, so much of low level of confidence on China. Until this on this particular issue, China very remarkably demonstrates its it's trying to have a different path as far as geopolitical issues are concerned. I think in geoeconomic issues, Americans would continue to divide the Asian countries. I would say that when it talks about what you call it renegotiating the deal with number of countries, right? I'm sure what it is aiming at is ultimately isolating China, right? Isolating China so that all these countries, in the name of this, in the name of that, would come together and help US do rebuild its economy, rebuild its what you call it structure, the socioeconomic structures also.
That's right. I think
I would add to what Mahendra is saying very quickly. What could happen is that if we say India says that we have an advantage because our tariff is less than, say, tariff of Vietnam or tariff of China, and we therefore negotiate on that basis, it doesn't necessarily follow that our trade would increase, because what he's trying to do is to increase production within the US. And if there's a recession, then of course, the demand for Indian products will also go down. So that's why I was saying earlier that we should not put all eggs in one basket and say that we are going to negotiate separately with the USA. We should actually join the group of the other nations, because there can be a recession in the US, decline in demand, our exports could fall, because, as people say, that if there's a fire in the forest, then everybody gets singed. Some may get singed more, some may get singed less. So we may have an advantage in terms of Vietnam's tariff or China's tariff, but we will also be singed. So therefore, we have to look at the long-term interest rather than the immediate short-term, because in the immediate short-term, even if we gain a little, we lose out in the long-term. So I think we have to look at our long-term interest, and other nations also. We have to persuade other nations to also look at the long-term interest and help them. So India, China, EU have a major role to play in that.
Absolutely. And I think we must also remember that our manufacturing is still pretty low. We are still at 13-14% of our GDP. But it gives us an opportunity to also work on that area. Kalyani, would you want to call out your question?
Thank you, sir. Beyond the immediate bilateral trade impacts, I want to know how this Trump administration's unilateral tariff measures challenge the authority of the organizations like World Trade Organization. And do these actions actually signal a structural weakening of the rules-based on global trade governance? And what are the long-term implications for countries who are actually relying on the WTO dispute settlement systems? Thank you.
That's true. WTO is pretty much lame and made by the USA. Professor Arun Kumar, would you want to comment on this?
Okay, so there have been disputes, and the dispute settlement mechanism is almost dead, because the US is not allowing the WTO dispute settlement mechanism people who should be there. They're not allowing them to be appointed. So dispute settlement is not going on, and therefore, in a sense, the US is doing all this outside the framework of WTO. Now, even the IMF and the World Bank may actually feel helpless in the face of what the US is doing. So this multilateralism that had come in, and that helped the advanced countries, because the terms of trade shifted in their favor. So what shifted in their favor, they want to actually get more. That's why I keep saying that the soft face of capitalism is being replaced by a hard face of capitalism, saying that we will, through brute force, do what we want to do. So this brute force that is being utilized, that is what we see. But because of the break in the advanced countries alliance, there is an opportunity that we can, now make this system much more democratic. And there have been moves, for the last 20 years to make these institutions more democratic ever since the financial crisis of 2007-9. there have been demands to make IMF, World Bank, etc., more democratic and not be under the hegemony of the advanced nations. So that's why, as Professor Lama also said earlier, there are opportunities for the developing world, provided we act together. And this is very important. This is where India, China have to take a lead to try and see that we act together, to see that we get a better deal than what we got earlier.
Thank you.
See,
Yes, Professor Lama, go ahead. Yeah.
Could I, yeah. It's very interesting to note two very distinct actions in President Trump's moves. One, of course, is by imposing unilateral tariff, right? He has informally withdrawn himself from the WTO arrangement because the world, the most favored nation treatment would not allow him to do this, right? But at the same time, unlike from the climate change negotiations, right? Unlike from the Trans-Pacific Partnership Program, he has not emphatically and he has not formally withdrawn from WTO, IMF, World Bank, and many other organizations, which would actually impinge upon him, right, or on his actions. So, in a way, what he's saying, what he's trying to do is, okay, I have a new, what you call it, fangs of hegemonism. I'm now displaying it, right, without demolishing the global institutions, right? Now, I would like to accommodate all these fangs of newer hegemonic practices in the institutions that already exists. So he will change the basic structures of IMF, the World Bank, the WTO in such a manner that it suits him, right? And why should we wait? My question is, why should we wait for him? We must tell him, if you are not interested, you withdraw. Can you really withdraw from World Bank, IMF, or can you really withdraw from WTO? That would be magically, I feel a little upset precisely because the free market, free trade, the schools in US is literally quiet on these issues, right? I haven't seen them as vocal as they used to be in bringing the free trade regime. I thought they would be more vocal in sustaining it, in keeping it alive, and in consolidating it further. But it is not so today.
Thank you. Captain Bangara, your question. This is the last question.
Evening, sir. This is regarding the imports into China. From what I have, in 2024, the imports from Vietnam was about 41%, which is almost about 11 million TEUs, 11 million containers, vis-a-vis what came from Vietnam, which is about maybe 3 million TEUs. So South Korea has got about 5% of the imports, and India, we were 4%. Now, considering if China had to look for alternatives for this kind of exports, and they do rely heavily on their exports, would they be under pressure to negotiate with the US in order to accommodate, because they may not find the immediate markets to accommodate this kind of volumes out of China? So would it affect their economy, or would they be under pressure to accommodate US instead?
The Lama?
I'm not able to hear there's some disruptions in the internet. Please go ahead. Please go ahead.
I think what the question is that, the extra output in China, which was exported to USA, what would happen to that? Because there'll be substantial amount of surplus, given the surplus that the US had. So I think this is the question that I had partly addressed when I was speaking, that the Chinese would have to negotiate with other nations, because if other nations trade with the US also comes down, they would also have surplus. So the rest of the world would have surpluses,
Yes.
So India would have surplus, South Korea would have surplus, Japan would have surplus, and you'd have to accommodate each other. So that would have to be worked out through negotiations, that what was earlier going to America would have to go to other nations, and what nations were importing from the US, because that will also come down. So their requirement will also come down. Now, I'm not saying they'll be matched. The decline in the US export would offer, a certain amount of market to other nations to export to each other. So this would have to be negotiated. That's why I argued that China would have to play a very important role and show that they're not dumping. Because if the threat of dumping is there, then every nation would start putting tariff. Then there'd be a chaos completely all over the world, and you'd have a long-term recession. Because every nation putting the tariff on everybody would mean everybody's prices would rise, supply chains would be disrupted, and there would be a long-term recession. If it is only against the US, then it'd be quite orderly, and the recession could end once the US backs down on that. So therefore, again, I would say that China has to play a very, very important role in assuring everybody that they're not going to dump, that they are going to take surpluses from other nations, and therefore, orderly movement can be there on trade front.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Yeah, because I think China has a very critical role to play, precisely because its trade deficit is almost $430 billion, as against India's hardly $50 billion. So, in a way, the entire dynamics are driven in such a manner that it hits the China most, right? And as a result of which, you could see how sharply it reacted to US, because it knows the cost it would impinge upon its economy. So in a way, China also now has no other options than to negotiate with markets around, far off, maybe in Latin America to Africa, to Europe, to, of course, Asia. I think China would, to a large extent, soften its position as a kind of a kind of a country which also believed to a large extent in realist school of thought.
Thank you. One last question from Dr. Katie John from Melbourne. Sir, if you're online, would you call out the question?
Thank you, Madhusudan. Can you hear me?
Yes. Go ahead.
Oh, thank you. I think the Prof. Arun, Kumar, and the other eminent speaker really answered my question. The comment was in relation to the other disruptions that Trump has been causing within the U.S., including against the judiciary and even a kind of an interpretation of the Constitution in a very, very unitary kind of a way. So I think the social disruption that it is going to cause maybe will bring this resolution to this tariff issue much quicker than what we would anticipate. So would you think if you put all that together, do you think this tariff issue may go away in the medium term?
Well, as far as I can see, the US will be hit quite hard within the next few months itself. And then it'll all depend on how much the public begins to rise up.
Right.
For instance, the migrant issue, they're saying we'll send the migrants back, but then who's to provide the cheap labor? Who in the US would work for $3, $4 an hour, which, the migrant labor does. And therefore, the agriculture will rise, agriculture prices will rise. USA's agriculture position would be affected. Plus, you see, there'll be a social problem because a lot of these are family members. So families would be in trouble in the US, especially from Mexico and other Latin American countries and other nations. Then the universities are being impacted. And that's where you generate knowledge. And that's what was, the basis of generation of a lot of research. You're impacting their ability to do research. You're impacting the most, productive universities. So therefore, there'll be a reaction within the intellectual community as well. And the blue-collar workers finding that the jobs are not coming back, they're also going to react. because it's not going to be easy to bring jobs back. If you have to set up capacity, it'll take 2-3 years for that capacity to come up. And in the meanwhile, there'll be shortages and supply disruptions. So therefore, the workers will be upset. LGBTQ are upset. Women will be upset because of the kind of stand that he's taking on women. They were upset even before the elections. So there are many social groupings also. The question is, how soon will they come out on the streets? How soon will they start protesting? That will be the thing, and how the Democrats are able to mobilize them. If the Democrats are able to mobilize them, then it'll be much quicker. So it'll all depend, you're right that the various social issues will also come up, and therefore the reversals depend on how these mobilizations take place and the Democrats' actions on that front.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Thank you.
Let me make a quick, make a quick intervention?
Please.
It's very interesting to see the large-scale condemnation in all the national and the subnational newspapers about President Trump. There's not a single word of appreciation for him, because he has upset even the communities at the very, very micro level. I'm in Nepal now, and yesterday I met some senior officials and quite a few friends in civil society, and I was asking them what is the impact of withdrawal of US aid projects in Nepal. He says overnight it sent almost 25,000 people to direct unemployment basket, right? And almost 200,000 people are affected by withdrawing. You can imagine what would have happened to a country like India, a country like Vietnam, or several countries in Latin America and Africa. So there's a very big concern at the very micro level, in the vernacular media, and at the macro level in the English language media. But both of them have a common tenor that we condemn Trump to the deepest extent possible. That is the state of American image in most of these countries today.
Thank you. That's wonderful. We've come to the end of our session. So let me just conclude with requesting concluding remarks from both the panelists with one question. Is the US consistent with its characteristic of being a predatory power? Ever since in the 19th century, middle of 19th century, they sailed to Japan and pointed a gun at their head and said, open up. So is this a similar behavior? Professor Lama, your concluding remarks?
I think this time, United States under President Trump is cornered. Now, in the prey-predator relationship, he is now going to be a prey rather than a predator.
Professor Arun Kumar?
I think I would sort of nuance that, a bit, because it really depends on what the rest of the world does. Can the rest of the world get together? If they are able to get together, the main players, China, EU, India, etc., BRICS, then I think it'll work like that. Otherwise, I think chaos in the world will increase. And from a chaotic situation, it'll be very difficult to recover. And there'll be a much deeper recession in the world economy as a result of what's going on. So I would sort of say that, we have to really nuance the things. We have to see the reaction within the US. We have to see the reaction of the major players in the world before we can actually, really come to a conclusion.
Thank you very much, Professor Arun Kumar and Professor Lama. It's been a great pleasure interacting with you both. And Professor Lama has joined us from Kathmandu, and Professor Arun Kumar from Delhi. And I also thank the audience for a wonderful participation. Let me hand over to Divya for the concluding word of thanks. Divya?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. First of all, thank you everyone for your active participation throughout the webinar, from the questions to the insightful discussions from the experts. Before we conclude, I'd like to extend a sincere gratitude to our esteemed speakers, Professor Arun Kumar and Professor Mahendra P. Lama, for generously sharing their time and perspective. I hope interns from TPF has gathered insightful information from the experts. A special thanks to Air Marshal M. Matheshwaran for moderating this session and for his leadership at the Peninsula Foundation. We also thank our audience for joining us today and engaging with such thought-provoking questions. This concludes our webinar. Stay connected with us through our website and social media for upcoming updates on the events and publications. Have a great evening.
Thank you
very much.
Thank you.